All right, well, welcome again. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelsey De Rinaldes. I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. We are pleased to welcome Gregory Poling, who's joining us today from Washington. He's the Director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and is a Senior Fellow at the Southeast Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, SAIS, in Washington. He oversees research on U.S. foreign policy in the Asia Pacific, with a particular focus on maritime domain and countries of Southeast Asia. His particular expertise is on the South China Sea disputes, democratization in Southeast Asia, and Asian multilateralism. He's frequently featured in press on these topics as well. Before we begin today, may I remind everyone to please mute your microphones and turn off your videos. We also will be recording this session. After the speaker's opening remarks, we will take questions. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function or type in the chat box. At the end, we will also be sending a survey through the chat box as well. So please enjoy and please participate in that. Lastly, we may ask that everyone please use your name so that we can record who is participating here today. All right. Thank you again so much for joining us, everyone, and welcome Gregory Poling. Greg, over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Kelsey, and thanks to the embassy for setting this up. We're stuck teleworking here in Washington too, so it's nice to get to see people, even if it's in a small box. So the reason that the embassy reached out is because, as I'm sure most of you know, we've been seeing a lot of stories over the last maybe 2 weeks suggesting that perhaps amid the coronavirus pandemic and the distraction in Washington and in Tokyo and in Southeast Asian capitals, that Beijing is taking advantage of the situation to increase the pace of operations in the South China Sea. I think that narrative is fair, but I think perhaps it misses some of the point because it misses what's been happening for the last 18 or 24 months in the South China Sea. To me, looking at the data that we have at the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, what seems to be the case is that China is continuing on a pretty gradual increase in presence, in operations, in harassment in the South China Sea. And the fact that that hasn't slowed down at all amid the current pandemic is what is particularly, I think, offensive to people. The idea that even amid a generational crisis, Beijing hasn't taken its foot off the pedal. So let's talk first about what we've seen recently, why these storylines have come out. I think a lot of this traces back 3 weeks to when you saw statements from the Chinese state media that China was inaugurating 2 new research centers at its artificial island bases in the Spratly Islands, particularly at Firecross Reef and at Subi Reef. We don't see any evidence that there was really any big new construction or opening of a new building. More likely they just stood up a unit at these existing facilities. But what's weird is that they would put that press release out in the middle of a pandemic, especially with the Filipinos and the Vietnamese and the Malaysians so worried about what's coming from China, and then to see the Chinese put that press release out. And that got a lot of bad press, particularly in the Philippines, and started to spread globally. Then you had announcements of new military exercises in the South China Sea, and most spectacularly, early this week, you had the collision between a Vietnamese fishing boat, or I should say over the weekend, a Vietnamese fishing boat, and a Chinese Coast Guard vessel just 9 miles from Woody Island, which is the biggest of China's islands in the South China Sea. This is in the Paracels. And this is unusual. Chinese Coast Guard ships harass and board and interdict Vietnamese fishing vessels all the time in the Paracels. They don't usually ram them and sink them. It took a few days to figure out exactly what was happening. The Chinese, of course, denied. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs insisted that it was a normal law enforcement operation and that the Vietnamese had gotten aggressive and veered into the Chinese boat. I will leave it to you to decide, but when you look at the photos that have been released by the Vietnamese, it's pretty clear that their boat was hit amidships. They didn't do the ramming. The China Coast Guard vessel did the ramming. And so that has naturally led people to wonder, are the Chinese using this opportunity to start throwing their weight around? And like I said, I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think this incident with the sinking is the inevitable result of Chinese policy that's been in place for a while now. China completed the construction of these artificial islands in 2016. It built most of the infrastructure for them by the end of 2017. And starting in 2018, it started rapidly deploying high-end military platforms, jamming equipment, missile platforms, military patrol aircraft. The point that we are at now is Chinese dominance in peacetime of the South China Sea. There's no way around that. China has more boats than anybody else. China has the signals intelligence and the radar ability to see everything that moves on or above the South China Sea. China has a maritime militia that has grown exponentially. The number of vessels of its so-called fishing vessels, but that we know are actually government-run militia vessels, has increased to up to 300 on any given day at Mischief Reef and Subi Reef and the Spratlys. And so it's a numbers game. When China puts this many actors into this contested a space and gives them standing orders to go out there and enforce Chinese claims, meaning keep an eye on the neighbors, harass them if they do something we don't like, go fish wherever you want, go prevent them from drilling for oil and gas whenever you want, sooner or later something like this was bound to happen. What it also highlights for me is that, I'm sure that Xi Jinping and the leadership in Zhongnan really don't want to fight in the South China Sea right now. This is not good for them, given the PR struggle they're in right now to spin the origin of the coronavirus. And yet they don't seem to be able to control their people because these standing orders run by Hainan province, by the South Sea Fleet, by the state-owned oil companies, they operate in this environment now where they're encouraged to go out and throw their weight around. And the only time anybody in Beijing seems to pay attention is when it provokes a crisis. One of the things that I've said in response to this narrative, that things have changed over the last few weeks is, well, if we look back even 6 months, we saw this exact same kind of activity. It just either wasn't that well covered in the international press, or memories were so short that it was quickly forgotten. I mean, if we remember from last May until last October, we saw a series of Chinese harassment incidents involving Malaysian oil and gas operations and Vietnamese oil and gas operations. And in the case of the Vietnamese, the Chinese at one point had over 50 vessels, Coast Guard vessels, Navy vessels, and militia vessels deployed to try to prevent Vietnamese drilling in Vietnamese waters and to do their own illegal survey in Vietnamese waters. We then had, from December onward, a huge, dozens of boats, Chinese fishing flotilla with half a dozen Coast Guard escorts operating in the waters off Indonesia, as well as in the waters off Malaysia and Brunei. That same month, the Chinese returned to harass Malaysian oil and gas drilling again. We have hundreds of Chinese boats continuing to deploy around Thitu Island, which is the largest of the Philippine-held features. So it's not that suddenly the Chinese have become more aggressive. It's that at a time when I think people would have expected better behavior, it hasn't happened. Now, I think that ultimately hurts China's position. It's going to hurt China's narrative at a time when it's already struggling, as I said, to try to spin the current coronavirus. It doesn't look good to be putting its boot on the throat of its neighbors who are dealing with this pandemic. If there is a silver lining for Beijing, it is that regional distraction and distraction from the US is such that we haven't come up with a very coordinated response. We did see a statement from the State Department earlier this week blasting the sinking of the Vietnamese fishing vessel, and then we saw a statement from the Pentagon just yesterday. But it's not clear what comes of that. A US aircraft carrier visited Da Nang for just the second time last month, and everybody's already forgotten, right? There's only so much attention when we're in the middle of a global pandemic. The Malaysians have been continuing to drill in the face of pretty aggressive Chinese harassment, Coast Guard and Navy, for months now, and nobody talks about it because, again, it's a global pandemic. So it's not clear to me how much cost China will actually pay for this, because it's not clear to me how much people are going to pay attention or remember. The other thing that's problematic, of course, is this was the year that Vietnam was going to really throw its weight around a bit. This is the year that Vietnam takes the ASEAN chairmanship. It's the year that Vietnam takes a seat on the UN Security Council, and Vietnam is the only one of the Southeast Asian claimants who seems clear-eyed about China's intentions. The Philippines is obviously dealing with its own problems because of the Duterte government. It doesn't really matter what public opinion says or what the armed forces say. Duterte is convinced that he either can't or shouldn't stand up to China on anything. The Malaysian government is in turmoil, but even before, there was an unwillingness to talk about what was happening in the South China Sea. And Indonesia, as long as the Chinese don't push too hard on the fisheries front, has very little interest in showing any leadership here. So a lot of hope was invested in Vietnam, having their new soapbox. Now it's pretty clear that they're not going to get a chance to make the most of this chairmanship. They've already had to delay the ASEAN summit until the summer, if it even happens then. Any hopes on leveraging the code of conduct talks to push the Chinese are probably gone, as there's unlikely to be many code of conduct meetings. And Hanoi is going to have to very carefully balance its own economic troubles now with the fact that it has a party congress coming up in just a year. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that I do think that we should all be a bit outraged by China's continued harassment. But we should recognize that this isn't new. This isn't something that Beijing has decided to do over the last 3 weeks. This is something that Beijing set in motion years ago. It's the number of Chinese vessels out there, the aggressiveness of their behavior. It's no different than it was 6 months ago. It will be even worse a year from now, and it'll be worse a year after that. And pretty soon, the South China Sea will be a Chinese lake unless something changes. The coronavirus, if anything, makes it less likely that anything's going to change, because the kind of multinational leadership that we need to see, led by the United States and Japan and Australia and the European nations, that seems pretty hard to muster in the face of a global pandemic. And so why don't I wrap up there? I wanted to keep this pretty broad because I don't know where you'd like to take the questions and answers, but I'm happy to discuss any aspect of this.
Thank you so much, Greg, for those comments.